Hi everybody. I mentioned in the sermon yesterday that I'd just do a little video extra to expand on a couple of points that I thought might be helpful that it was hard to know whether we had time for yesterday. I mentioned that as we looked at circumcision and the Passover, the New Testament equivalents of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And that raises questions over, well, who should be baptized, who should take the Lord's Supper, and so on. It also connects to a question we had in our introductory sermon about how we view God's people in Joshua, because we've talked about them entering the land, entering God's kingdom. Does that mean they're all saved? Does that mean they are all truly God's people? Because later on we'll see in the book some of them actually fall under judgment, which doesn't seem quite right. So similarly, the reason that these things connect, we could ask here, they're all circumcised, they all take the Passover. Does that mean they are all truly God's people? And I think this is one of the areas of difference between the Old Covenant in the Old Testament and the New Covenant in the New under Jesus. Those covenants are clearly similar, they're clearly connected, but there are some differences. The New Covenant is new in some way, and the debate is effectively new in what way? How new is it, and how similar is it? Because they're so similar, it's why we can learn from Joshua. There are lots of similarities between them, and so lessons from there for them are lessons for us now. So the way God gets them into the land, the way he uses Joshua as his sort of anointed rescuer, and so on. We've been learning lessons along those lines, and that's absolutely right. So there are lots of similarities, but there are some differences, and I think here are some of the key ones. In the Old Covenant, there is this kind of automatic inclusion in the covenant. Anybody who is a descendant of Abraham, anyone who's in that family line, is included kind of automatically in that covenant relationship. In other words, they're included whether they personally have faith in God's promises or not. And so every male child is circumcised and marked out, because it's almost like it or not, they enter into a covenant relationship with God. The question then is what they'll do with that. And that's why there are then calls within the Old Testament to circumcise their hearts, for example, to have true faith, to enter into a covenant relationship, trusting God's promises for themselves. And so this results in Israel being a kind of a mixed community. There's all of Israel, as it were, one big circle, and they are all marked out as God's people. And in many ways, we can talk about them as being God's people because they are all kind of inheritors of his promise. They all, in a sense, have some degree of relationship with him, whether they have faith or not, because they live in the land and they benefit from the harvests, and in the future benefit from kings and victory in battle and so on. But they are all called then to personally have faith. So within the big circle is like a smaller circle of those who are truly God's people, who personally trust him. This is why, for example, the Apostle Paul can say, not all Israel is Israel. And what he means is not all ethnic Jews, the whole nation, are truly God's people. Not all Israel is Israel. And so there's this kind of two levels of membership, if you like. Everyone's included in a covenant relationship at one level, but then called to trust God themselves. That's why they all enter the land, and yet some of them could then fall away. That's why they are all circumcised and all eat the Passover. And yet, actually, not all of them truly trust God. Now, some people argue and believe that there is a parallel between that situation and the church today. The church is mixed in that way, and there's the kind of automatic inclusion, and so children of believers ought to be baptized, ought to be marked as God's people. We ought to talk about them as being in a covenant relationship with God. Some, not all, some also think children should then also take the Lord's Supper. There are other debates on that I won't go into. And so this is where the debate is the new covenant parallel with the old in that way, or is there something new about it? Well, in the new covenant, we know it is only those who have faith who are in the covenant. And my understanding, and kind of broadly our understanding as a church, is that there isn't two levels. It's not that you can be in but not truly in. If you have faith, you're united with Christ and you are fully in. Or we could say, if you have faith, Paul says in Galatians 3, you are a child of Abraham. You are one of his descendants. You're part of God's people truly. And it's not something then that you are born into, even at a lesser level. In other words, there's really only one circle. Now, that's not to say that everybody in the church is truly converted. People could be confused, could be deceived. We could get that wrong in evaluating it, but that would be a mistake, as it were, rather than something that God had instituted as how his people were made up. My understanding is that God's people is now just those who have faith. There's just the one circle. And that's why, as a church, we then only baptize those who profess faith in Jesus, and why we think it's only those who say they are trusting Jesus who should take the Lord's Supper. Now, let me be clear. There are differences here between Bible-believing Christians. It's a point of debate. I teach at a theological college where there are people on both sides. I take part in a debate on this to help the students think through, and I understand and respect the arguments on the other side, say for baptizing children. But that is our position as a church, and so our practice as a church. And I thought it might be helpful off the back of that sermon to explain that. As we study Joshua then, there are these great similarities in how God works. That's why we can learn from it. But there are going to be some differences, and there's a key one for us. I hope that's helpful.